The first sound you remember isn't your mother's voice or the murmur of any comforting lullaby. It's the grinding shudder of a ventilation stack older than your ancestry, straining to push another breath of stale air into the hive's endless throat. Light never truly reaches you down here. It only trickles through layers of industrial haze, refracted by chemical dust, until it feels like a memory of illumination rather than the thing itself. You walk narrow corridors that sweat condensation and machine oil, listening for footsteps that might be friendly, dangerous, or simply desperate. Every shadow hides a story that ended abruptly. Every open space feels like a promise that will not be kept. And as you move through this colossus of steel and stone, this impossible, suffocating monument built by the Imperium of man, you begin to understand why people say the hive itself is alive. It groans, it hungers, it remembers you only as long as you are useful. After that, it forgets you with the indifference of a god carved from concrete. Before we descend deeper into this world, breathe for a moment and steady yourself. If you want more journeys into places where history is written in ash and survival demands more than courage, then stay close. Lend your voice to this channel, and let your presence be known through the simple acts of liking, sharing, and subscribing. Even a hive notices when another ember glows in the dark. I remember the moment the doors sealed behind us, not because of any dramatic clang of metal or the barked orders of the escorts, but because of the sudden quiet that followed. An almost reverent silence that settled over the chamber like dust. The administratum clerks had moved us forward with the efficiency of a faulty conveyor belt, grinding human lives into the shape required by a bureaucracy older than most civilizations. And it wasn't until that door finally shut that the truth began to settle in my bones. Whatever I had been before stepping into that transport, whatever name my mother whispered to me in gentler years, whatever stories I once believed were important, all of it had been swallowed by a system that never bothered to chew. The escorts didn't need to say a word. Their presence alone, heavy with the implied authority of the Imperium and the smell of oiled weapons, carried a message sharper than any force maul. We belonged to them now. The air inside the transport bay felt wrong. Too dry, too warm, as if recycled one time too many. It tasted like old parchment and fear, and that taste clung to the back of my throat as the new recruits shuffled into uneven lines. No one knew where to stand, and no one wanted to be the first to ask. Even those who had marched into the intake lines with some bravado, chest puffed and chin high, found themselves shrinking under the weight of the unknown. Fear doesn't always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it arrives quietly, curling around your ribs until each breath feels like an intrusion into someone else's atmosphere. Sometimes it just waits, patient as a starved hound. The clerks, robed in drab cloth bearing stains that looked older than any of us, called names from data slates in tones utterly devoid of life. Their recitation wasn't meant to be heard by humans. It was intended for the system itself, a ritual affirmation that the numbers matched the bodies. I learned quickly that the Imperium thrives not on precision, but on the illusion of it. The clerks did not care if names were mispronounced, if the people they marked down were trembling or weeping or visibly ill. To them, we were inventory. Breathing, sweating inventory destined to be sent where needed. And nowhere in their protocol was there room for hesitation or sympathy. I watched a boy near me, couldn't have been older than 15, still carrying the softness of someone who had never held a weapon, wipe his palms on his trousers so many times the cloth darkened with nervous sweat. When one of the escorts told him to stand straighter, he obeyed so quickly he nearly fainted. I never learned his name. People think war erases life quickly, but the machine that leads toward war does it just as efficiently. He was processed, categorized, and removed from my sight before I could even speak a word. That early loss, that small erasure, taught me something essential. This was not a journey where companionship came naturally. Bonds had to be carved, not discovered, and carved with the tools fear provided. The room itself felt like a holding cell designed to look like something else, with its gray walls, humming lumen globes, and faint smell of solvent. Someone had tried to scrub blood from the floor earlier and failed. The stain remained, dark and rusted, as a promise of things to come. Everyone noticed it. Everyone pretended they didn't. Denial is a form of prayer when you have nothing else left. When the interrogator, disguised as an officer, though I could tell even then his authority was something more sinister, entered the room, the escorts snapped to rigid attention. Not out of respect, but out of obligation. The kind that comes from knowing this man could end their careers with a gesture, or their lives with a second gesture. He carried no decoration to denote rank, but the way space seemed to shift around him, as if reluctant to touch his boots, said more than any insignia could. His eyes scanned the room with the interest of someone choosing tools from a shelf. He didn't speak at first. He merely walked down the line of recruits, pausing occasionally to tilt someone's chin or adjust their stance. When he stopped in front of me, I felt something cold crawl up the back of my neck. His gaze lingered longer than it had on the others, studying me as though he could already see layers I didn't know I had. He didn't ask my name. He didn't need to. In that moment, I realized that whatever I had been before, worker, son, nobody, meant nothing to him. What mattered was potential. Potential for obedience, potential for survival, potential for being shaped into something the Imperium could use, even if the shaping destroyed me in the process. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried through the room like the scrape of a blade against stone. He told us we had been chosen, not blessed, not rescued. Chosen, the way one chooses a piece of scrap metal with the hope it can be reforged into a useful component. He didn't promise glory or victory. He didn't even promise survival. Instead, he assured us that our old lives had been severed cleanly. The implication, unspoken but heavy as a gravestone, was that our futures could be just as easily severed if we failed to meet expectations. After his inspection, the doors opened again, not the ones we had entered through, but a set of blast doors that hissed as if the air behind them were relieved to escape. We were motioned forward, herded like livestock into a transport shuttle that shuddered in anticipation. The escorts guided us with a practiced efficiency, ensuring no one lagged behind or drifted from the designated path. The shuttle smelled of oil, metal, and old sweat, the combined perfume of 1,000 terrified souls who had occupied these seats before us. The harness straps were frayed. Some bore scorch marks. A few had dried flecks of something that might once have been blood. I sat because there was no other option. The thrum of the engines starting up resonated through my bones. It felt like the vessel itself was swallowing air before taking the plunge. When the clamps released and gravity shifted, a ripple of panic went through the recruits. I didn't scream, though the urge clawed at my throat. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and tried to count the flickers of the lumen strips, hoping their rhythm could anchor me. As the shuttle rose, I glimpsed through the small, scratched window, the world I had known shrinking beneath us. The distant skyline blurred into indistinct gray shapes, the manufactura and hab blocks blending into something that looked almost peaceful from afar. I wondered if my mother was looking at the sky at that exact moment, sensing some absence she couldn't name. Or perhaps she was still working, unaware that her child had already been claimed. The thought tightened something inside my chest, but I forced it down. Attachment was a luxury the Imperium rarely tolerated. The shuttle's ascent was harsh, nothing like the smooth flights described in propaganda bulletins. We jerked, dropped, lurched sideways, and endured a turbulence that made several recruits vomit into their laps. One fainted entirely, head lolling to the side like a puppet with cut strings. No one helped him. Not out of cruelty, but out of a dawning understanding. We couldn't afford to reveal weakness when eyes like the interrogators were always watching. Eventually the vibrations steadied. The void awaited us, endless, silent, and indifferent. The shuttle connected with a larger transport ship, and we were marched again, this time into a corridor that hummed with mechanical life. The walls vibrated faintly, as though the ship had a heartbeat. Perhaps it did. The Imperium often built machines with more soul than its citizens. The next chamber was larger, filled with rows of benches and a lectern at the front. A drill abbot waited there, his presence towering even though he was not physically imposing. Scar tissue crawled across his face like pale roots, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades molding recruits into soldiers. Or corpses. He began speaking before we were even fully seated, his words sharp, efficient, and merciless. He told us we were untested clay. He told us most clay shatters under pressure. He told us the only path ahead was obedience. He did not say this with malice, but with certainty, as though reading a weather report. His speech was a storm, not a rousing call to arms, but a stripping away of illusions. I felt layers peeling off inside me. Hope, fear, pride, all sanded down to something harder, something that could endure, or break cleanly. As he spoke, I noticed the guards stationed around the room. Their hands rested lightly on their weapons, but their eyes betrayed nothing. Not boredom, not interest, not empathy. They were fixtures of the environment, part of the machinery designed to shape us. I realized then that the Imperium did not need to threaten us constantly. The threat was built into every corridor, every uniform, every command barked into stale air. It existed in the knowledge that our lives had already been signed away. After the speech, we were divided into smaller groups and sent down branching hallways lit by flickering lumen strips. My group was silent, each person processing the reality that had begun to settle over us. One boy sobbed quietly, each breath a shudder that shook his thin frame. No one told him to stop. No one comforted him either. Compassion felt dangerous, as though acknowledging his fear might allow our own to slip free. The dormitory we were assigned to consisted of metal bunks stacked 3 high, each with a thin mattress that felt more like insulation material than bedding. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of sweat, mildew, and something acidic that made my eyes water. There were no personal items, no decorations, nothing to suggest humanity had ever left a mark here. Only the hum of ventilation units and the distant thrum of ship engines. As I climbed into my bunk, I realized the true purpose of intake wasn't to prepare us for war. It was to erase us, to strip away everything that might complicate obedience, to reduce us to vessels ready to be filled with doctrine, discipline, and the relentless demands of the Imperium. In that moment, lying on a mattress that felt like punishment, I understood that I had already been reshaped. The process had begun long before the first drill, long before the first shouted order. It had begun the moment I stepped into the administratum line, surrendering my old life to a system that did not care whether I survived the transformation. Sleep did not come easily. Every sound, the creak of metal, the shift of bodies, the distant murmur of machinery, felt like a warning. I stared into the dimness and wondered how many recruits before me had lain in this exact bunk, feeling this exact fear, and how many had endured long enough to discover what lay beyond it. Somewhere in the dark, someone whispered a prayer. Not a loud one, not even a confident one, but a trembling plea offered to whatever force might listen. I didn't know the words, but the desperation in them reached me. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine the Emperor's gaze falling upon us in that suffocating dormitory, seeing not soldiers but frightened children. The moment passed quickly. The lights flickered. The hum deepened. The ship shifted, aligning itself with a trajectory that only those in command understood. We were in motion, and there was no turning back. Training began long before dawn, though none of us could tell when dawn truly was aboard that vast iron coffin. Time dissolved into cycles of orders and exhaustion, and whatever rhythm had once defined our lives was replaced by the barked cadence of drill abbots whose discipline came not from cruelty, but from something far more terrifying: absolute conviction. They believed entirely in the necessity of breaking us, and that belief shaped every moment of those early days. The first time the klaxon screamed through the dormitory, snapping us awake like startled animals, I felt a jolt of panic that nearly froze my limbs. But hesitation was punished even more quickly than disobedience. One recruit, slow to rise, confused by the darkness, was dragged from his bunk and slammed against the metal floor hard enough to chip a tooth. The drill abbot didn't strike him again. He didn't need to. That single impact served as a message to all of us that the world we had entered was not shaped by mercy. The corridors echoed with shouts and the pounding of boots as we scrambled after our instructors. Every step was a test. Every breath a reminder that we were not ready for what they demanded of us. The training hall was a cavern of cold metal and blinding lumen strips, the air thick with the scent of machine oil and sweat. Rows of training servitors waited in silent menace, their mechanical limbs twitching with preloaded combat routines. The moment we stepped inside, it felt as though the hall itself evaluated us, weighing our worth before a single exercise began. Our first drills were deceptively simple: stances, footwork, balance. Movements meant to teach us how to inhabit our own bodies as if they were weapons waiting to be sharpened. But simplicity is a lie. The drill abbots corrected every mistake with a precision bordering on sadism, striking us with shock staves not in anger, but in strict, ritualistic efficiency. Every blow told us that failure had a physical cost. Every success was ignored. Praise did not exist here, only the absence of punishment. After an hour, many recruits were trembling. After 2, some had collapsed. After 3, no one knew how much time had passed or how much remained. I remember the moment my legs buckled for the first time. The floor rushed toward me, and I caught myself on trembling palms, slick with sweat. The drill abbot turned his gaze toward me, and in that fraction of a second I felt the cold weight of his judgment settle over my spine. He said nothing. The silence was worse than any shout. I forced myself upright, pain flaring in my knees, and willed my body to obey despite its protests. In that instant, I understood that training wasn't about strength or skill. It was about obedience to movement itself. If your body failed, your mind was expected to drag it forward. If both failed, the Imperium simply discarded you. There was a boy beside me, thin, sharp-featured, with eyes that always seemed too large for his face. His name was Corvin. I learned that much before the drill abbots crushed names out of us. Corvin shook constantly, not from fear but from a strange, feral energy, as if he were someone who had never been permitted to rest. During drills he moved with a desperate sort of grace, striving to anticipate each correction before it arrived. The abbot noticed him, not as praise, as an anomaly. That attention alone made Corvin dangerous to stand beside. But somehow we drifted together in the chaos, bound not by friendship, but by an unspoken understanding that proximity to another struggling soul made the ordeal fractionally bearable. We were given breaks only long enough to prevent collapse. Meal periods were exercises in speed and discipline, silent cues, ladles of nutrient paste slapped into metal bowls, and the constant awareness that drill masters watched even as we ate. The paste tasted like metallic mud, thick and gritty, and left a film on the tongue that no amount of water washed away. But we devoured it with the single-minded desperation of those who knew hunger could weaken us worse than the drills. Corvin sat across from me during one of these meals. He didn't speak, but his gaze flicked nervously toward the drill abbots every few seconds. When someone down the row whispered a joke, Corvin flinched violently, as though expecting retribution simply for hearing it. I wondered what kind of life he had come from. I wondered what kind of life any of us had left behind. Weapons training came next. The drill abbots taught us to hold lasguns with the reverence of Scripture, and to dismantle and reassemble them with our eyes closed. Servitors marched alongside us, carrying racks of rifles stamped with unit markings from wars long forgotten. The first time I lifted one, I felt a strange conflict pull at my chest. The weapon was heavier than I expected, cold and awkward in my hands, but there was a grim solidity to it that whispered of potential. A lasgun is not elegant, it is not powerful, but it is reliable, and reliability is sacred in the Imperium. As I learned to fire in controlled bursts, my shoulder aching with every recoil suppressor vibration, I realized that this weapon would soon be more familiar to me than my own heartbeat. Failures were met with punishment, always swift and impersonal. If a recruit's shot drifted too far off target, the instructor forced them to fire again and again until their arms shook uncontrollably. If someone hesitated, they were ordered to sprint laps around the hall until they collapsed. One recruit, large, broad-shouldered, with a stubborn scowl, refused an order during a drill. He claimed the servitor malfunctioned. The drill abbot didn't argue. Instead, he disabled the boy's shock collar and let him attempt the drill again. When the recruit hesitated a second time, the abbot activated a nearby servitor's combat routine. The machine struck the boy to the ground in a blur of mechanical force. Blood spread across the steel tiles in quiet, widening arcs. No one intervened. No one even breathed. When the demonstration ended, the drill abbot simply said, "Obedience prevents malfunction. Disobedience creates it." And training continued as though nothing had happened. The barracks became our only refuge, though refuge was a generous word. The bunks were stiff, the air stale, and sleep came in small, fractured pieces. Recruits muttered in their dreams, snatches of prayers, names of loved ones, memories slipping from their grasp like sand through fingers. One night I woke to Corvin sitting upright on his bunk, his eyes wide and unfocused. He whispered something I didn't understand at first, a string of numbers, repeated over and over. When I asked what they meant, he blinked slowly, as if returning from a faraway place, and said they were the sequence codes printed on the servitor that had malfunctioned earlier that day. He had memorized them without meaning to. The training was implanting itself into us in ways we couldn't fully see. As days, or cycles, or whatever units of time governed our world passed, small rebellions flared and died. A recruit hid a crust of ration bread beneath his mattress. He was found out within hours. The drill abbots dragged him to the center of the hall and forced him to eat the moldy crust while shouting doctrine passages between bites. Another tried to shirk cleaning duty. He was assigned triple shifts for a week, scrubbing floors already clean until his hands blistered and bled. Every rebellion ended the same way, swiftly, silently, and without any lasting mark on the system that contained us. Only on the rebels themselves. Despite the crushing atmosphere, bonds began to form. Not openly, not with the kind of warmth that childhood friendships thrive upon, but with the quiet, shared recognition of suffering. We learned each other's breathing patterns during drills, recognized each other's silhouettes in the dim corridors, understood the subtle signs that someone was nearing collapse. Corvin and I spoke occasionally in hushed tones when the barracks lights dimmed. He told me he used to fix machinery in a manufactorum, though he admitted he wasn't very good at it. I told him I used to deliver parcels between hab blocks, though most days the parcels were empty, and the journey itself mattered more than the delivery. We both laughed quietly at the absurdity of our former lives. How insignificant they now seemed. One evening, as we scrubbed grime from the training hall's floors under the watchful eyes of a servitor, Corvin whispered that he had overheard 2 drill abbots speaking. They mentioned the next phase of training, something involving obstacle courses and live fire drills, something that had a casualty rate high enough to require additional intakes. The words sent a ripple of dread down my spine. If what we had endured so far was only preparation, what horrors waited ahead? The servitor's mechanical gaze swept across us, its optical sensors glowing faintly. I lowered my head and continued scrubbing. The next day confirmed Corvin's rumor. We were marched to a new chamber, one vast enough to house several manufactorum assembly lines. Instead of machinery, it contained towering structures of metal scaffolding, rope nets, walls smeared with grime, and platforms suspended above pits filled with shattered debris. The drill abbot stood before us, his expression unreadable. He told us that the obstacle course measured not only physical capability but judgment. Speed meant nothing if it led to mistakes. Hesitation meant nothing if it led to death. We would navigate it under live conditions. When the siren blared and the course activated, chaos exploded around us. Lasfire crackled from mounted turrets, forcing us to dive behind barriers. Servitors patrolled narrow walkways, swinging blunted weapons that could still break bone if they connected. As I climbed a rope net, slick with condensation, my fingers slipping on each knot, I felt the crackle of lasfire scorch the metal beside my head. Corvin was ahead of me, scrambling upward with frantic determination. One recruit below us lost his grip and fell into a pit lined with broken plasteel. His scream echoed, but was quickly drowned by the noise of the course. Medica teams would retrieve him later, if there was anything left to retrieve. By the time we reached the final section, my lungs burned and my limbs trembled. Ahead lay a narrow beam suspended over a deep trench. Steam rose from the depths, carrying the acidic smell of coolant. The drill abbots watched from above. Corvin stepped onto the beam first, arms outstretched for balance. He wavered, steadied, and made his way across. When my turn came, the edges of my vision blurred. The world narrowed to the width of the beam beneath my feet. Each step felt like a negotiation with gravity. Halfway across, a blast of hot air erupted from a vent below, nearly knocking me off balance. I steadied myself and pushed forward, driven not by courage but by sheer refusal to die in a training hall before proving anything. When I reached the other side, Corvin offered me a nod. Not a smile, not a word, just acknowledgement. It was enough. As the days passed, something strange began happening within us. Not pride, not confidence, something more unsettling. We adapted. Our muscles hardened, our breathing steadied. The pain that once scattered our thoughts became familiar, even manageable. We learned to anticipate the drill abbot's commands before they spoke. We moved in unison without meaning to. Our former selves, the frightened recruits who arrived on that first day, faded like shadows cast by a dying lumen strip. And yet, beneath the surface of that newfound strength, something fragile persisted. A thin, flickering ember of defiance that the Imperium could grind down but never fully extinguish. During one late cycle, as we stood in the barracks after a grueling drill, Corvin whispered that he kept a memory of home hidden inside him. Not a physical object, not a name, but a moment. A single moment he refused to surrender. I didn't ask what it was. I could see in his eyes that it was the only part of himself he still owned. I realized then that I had my own hidden ember. Not a memory, but a question. One that had begun forming quietly in the depths of my exhaustion. What would I become when training was complete? Not what the Imperium wanted, but what would remain of me when obedience became instinct? That question lingered as we lay in our bunks, the ship's engines humming like distant thunder. It lingered as the lights dimmed and the barracks fell into uneasy stillness. It lingered even as exhaustion pulled me toward sleep. Softly, beneath the machinery's hum, someone whispered a fragment of liturgy. Not the cold doctrine drilled into us, but something older, softer, fragile as breath. For the first time since intake began, I felt something stir in my chest. Not hope, not yet, but the faintest recognition that the person I had been before had not vanished entirely. A small part remained, waiting in the dark, and training, no matter how brutal, had not crushed it. Not yet. The regiment's deployment came without ceremony, as if the universe had grown weary of waiting for us to be ready. One moment we were recruits, still learning to keep our breathing steady under pressure. The next we were standing in formation on the embarkation deck, laser guns slung across our chests, flak armor rubbing uncomfortably against skin that had only recently healed from training wounds. The airship bay was a cavern of steel and resonance, filled with the rumble of engines and the distant clang of cargo cranes shifting war material. Every sound felt like a prelude to something larger, something we had spent weeks preparing for without ever fully understanding. No speeches were given, no blessings spoken aloud. A tech priest marched down our ranks, tapping each rifle with a mechadendrite, whispering Binharic prayers to the machine spirits. The only voice that addressed us directly belonged to a commissar, whose expression was carved from the same stone as the fortress walls. He strode past us with the measured authority of someone condemned to survive every battle he ordered others into. His cloak trailed behind him, edges frayed from past deployments. When he reached the front of our formation, he simply said that the Emperor expected us to fight until nothing remained of the enemy or ourselves. Anything less was treason. The boarding ramp shuddered as we were ushered into the transport craft. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic tang of recycled oxygen, mingled with the faint musk of unwashed bodies. The benches lining the interior were cold and narrow, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. As we strapped ourselves in, the engines roared to life with a vibration that thudded against our ribs. I saw Corvin across from me, knuckles white as he gripped the bench. Neither of us spoke. Words felt too fragile for a moment so heavy. The flight toward the war zone stretched endlessly. Occasionally, turbulence rattled the craft, and recruits flinched as though expecting enemy fire to burst through the hull. Some whispered prayers under their breath, invoking saints they barely remembered. Others simply stared at the floor, lost in whatever thoughts kept them steady. I found myself counting the rhythm of the engines, using each vibration to anchor my mind. The regiment's sergeant moved between the rows, checking buckles and equipment straps. His voice remained calm, almost disconcertingly so, as he reminded us that the transition from training to battle required no mental shift. The skills we had learned were meant to guide our bodies, even if our minds faltered. When the transport finally descended, gravity shifted violently. The landing gear struck soil with a thud that rippled through our bones. The ramp hissed open, and the war zone greeted us with a wave of heat, smoke, and distant explosions. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with soot and swirling ash. Trenches stretched across the landscape in jagged lines, some reinforced with plasteel barricades, others little more than gouges hastily carved into the earth. The air reeked of promethium and churned mud. It clung to our lungs like a second skin. Stepping onto that ground felt like stepping into another world, one carved not by nature, but by conflict itself. The terrain was alive with movement. Vox operators shouted orders over static-filled channels. Medici dragged wounded soldiers toward triage shelters fashioned from torn canvas. Artillery roared in the distance, each impact sending tremors through the earth. The enemy remained unseen, as though hiding just beyond the horizon, waiting for the moment we were too exhausted to resist. Our sergeant led us to a trench line that seemed to stretch into infinity. Guardsmen already stationed there barely acknowledged us. Their faces were gaunt, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. They reminded me of ghosts more than soldiers. One man shuffled past, his arm bandaged in a makeshift sling, muttering something about the East Ridge. He didn't look at any of us. It was as if the presence of new recruits meant nothing to him. Or perhaps we were a reminder of what he had once been. We took our positions behind the barricades. The trench floor was slick with mud, pooling around our boots. The sergeant told us to keep our heads low and our rifles ready. Corvin crouched beside me, his breath shaking despite his efforts to control it. I adjusted my footing, trying to find balance on the uneven ground. The trench wall pressed cold and damp against my back. For a while, nothing happened. The distant artillery continued its relentless rhythm, but no enemy charged our line. No lasfire streaked from the opposing trenches. Instead, the war zone breathed in slow, labored intervals, as if gathering strength before unleashing something catastrophic. In that stillness, the weight of insignificance settled heavily on my shoulders. We were tiny pieces in a system so vast it barely noticed our existence. All the training, all the pain, it prepared us only for the possibility of dying in a place no one would remember. The first attack didn't begin with shouting or warning. It came silently, like a shadow slipping across the battlefield. A ripple of movement flickered in the distance. Figures, blurred by smoke, emerged from trenches farther ahead. They moved oddly, their silhouettes jerking as though half stumbling, half dragged. A murmur spread down our line. Someone shouted for clarification over the Vox, but the reply was drowned by a sudden explosion that tore through the frontmost trench. Dirt and debris rained upon us, stinging cheeks and arms. Then the enemy fire began. Las shots streaked across the field like burning needles. Impact alarms screamed as they struck barricades. Instinct drove me to duck lower, pressing my body against the mud as streaks of red light carved the air above. Corvin fired blindly over the barricade, his rifle whirring as the charge cell heated. I lifted my weapon and aimed, searching for a clear target. The smoke made everything uncertain. Shifting shapes, flickering movement, nothing steady enough to confirm as human or hostile. The sergeant's voice cut through the chaos, ordering us to hold position and conserve ammunition. We obeyed, though fear gnawed at the edges of discipline. The trench shuddered as explosions bloomed along the ridge. Every blast sent shockwaves through the ground, shaking loose soil from the trench walls. I felt grains of dirt slide down my neck, cold and gritty. When the attack finally subsided, the silence felt even more suffocating than the violence. The air buzzed with residual heat. Wounded soldiers groaned, their voices raw. A Medici crawled through the trench, pressing coagulant patches onto wounds that bled too quickly. Corvin inhaled sharply, clutching his rifle to his chest. His hands trembled. Mine didn't, but only because they had passed beyond trembling into numbness. Hours passed with no further assaults. The enemy had withdrawn as suddenly as they had appeared. Our sergeant called it a probing maneuver, testing our response, measuring our strength. The thought chilled me. If this had been a test, what would the real attack look like? Night fell slowly, swallowing the sky in thick gradients of gray and black. Trench lumens flickered sporadically, casting uneven shadows along the walls. The temperature dropped, and the mud thickened into a clammy, suffocating paste. We rotated watch duty in shifts, though sleep offered little relief. Every sound jolted me awake. The snap of a twig, the hiss of steam from a misaligned vent, the distant howl of artillery. Even dreams betrayed me with images of burning skies and endless trenches. The regiment received new orders at dawn. We were to move toward the outer defenses, reinforcing a position that intelligence claimed was vulnerable. The veterans reacted with a resignation that chilled me. They had seen vulnerable positions before. They knew what such orders meant. Yet they shouldered their gear and moved out without argument. That was the nature of the Astra Militarum. You marched where commanded, and you fell where assigned. Anything else was treachery. We marched through the wreckage of what had once been a Hab settlement. Crushed buildings created jagged silhouettes against the fiery sky. Children's toys lay half buried in the rubble. A pict screen flickered weakly, replaying the same 2 seconds of a broadcast over and over. The sight of it all lodged something heavy in my chest. War didn't just destroy bodies. It erased lives so thoroughly that even memory struggled to keep up. Corvin walked quietly beside me, his gaze shifting constantly. He seemed smaller out here, dwarfed by the scale of destruction. If training had taught us obedience, the battlefield taught us insignificance. Every ruined structure whispered reminders of how little we mattered. We passed a burned-out transport filled with charred forms, fused to their restraints. The sergeant urged us to keep moving. When we reached the designated line, we were greeted by officers attempting to enforce a veneer of organization on the chaos. They barked orders that contradicted one another, gestured to maps smeared with dirt and blood, and shoved us into hastily built barricades fashioned from plasteel crates. Our new position overlooked a wide expanse of barren ground. Too wide, too flat. A perfect killing field for whichever side fired first. Rumors filtered through the ranks. Some claimed the enemy was massing for a major offensive. Others insisted that reinforcements were coming, though no one believed it. The commissariat remained silent, which was more unsettling than any threat. Commissars rarely stayed silent unless something catastrophic loomed. As we reinforced the barricades, I glanced up at the sky. Smoke had turned it nearly black. Amid the darkness, faint lights flickered. Orbital fire, drop pods, debris burning through atmosphere. Each streak carved a brief wound of brightness before vanishing. The planet itself seemed to groan under the strain of warfare. The attack struck just after dusk. This time it didn't come as scattered fire, but as a tidal wave of violence. Enemy artillery screamed overhead, detonating along the ridge. The earth erupted around us, sending cascades of mud and shrapnel into the trench. I felt the impact before I heard it, a bone-deep vibration that rattled teeth. Corvin stumbled beside me, nearly falling. I grabbed his arm and pulled him upright. Then the infantry charge began. Dozens of figures surged forward, weapons raised, voices lost in the roar of detonations. They moved with grim determination, their advance relentless despite our lass fire raining down upon them. I fired until the charge cell throbbed with heat, reloaded in a frenzy, and fired again. The noise was deafening, las fire crackling, bodies slamming into barricades, screams cutting through the din like torn metal. A soldier beside me took a round to the chest. He collapsed without a sound. Another fell moments later, clutching a mangled leg. Medici teams attempted to pull the wounded back, but the firefight was too intense. The trench became a crucible of mud, blood, and smoke. Throughout the chaos, the commissar emerged like an omen. He moved along the trench line, issuing commands in a calm, unwavering voice. When a guardsman panicked and attempted to flee, the commissar shot him without hesitation, stepping over the body to address the rest of us. His message was simple: stand and fight, or die by his hand before the enemies. The command steadied some, terrified others, but it kept the line from collapsing. We fought for what felt like hours. Every surge of the enemy pushed us closer to breaking, yet somehow we held. When the final wave fell back, retreating into the smoke, the battlefield fell into a heavy quiet. Bodies littered the ground in twisted heaps. The air shimmered with heat from spent las fire. My limbs trembled violently, though I couldn't tell if it was from exertion or shock. Corvin leaned against the barricade, staring blankly at his blood-splattered hands. He whispered that he had never wanted this. I told him none of us had. As the medici tallied casualties and officers planned the next maneuver, I felt the weight of what we had become settle around me like a second skin. Training had stripped us. War remade us. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and horror, a cold clarity took shape. We were insignificant, and yet somehow we were still alive. In the Imperium, that alone meant something. The longer we remained on that world, the more the front shifted from a battlefield into something stranger, a place where exhaustion blurred the edges of reality, and rumor held more weight than orders. After the third week of fighting, when sleep became a ration more scarce than ammunition, whispers began to seep through the regiment like a slow-moving fog. They slipped between trenches, floated over the ruins, and embedded themselves in the minds of soldiers too worn down to separate truth from delusion. Some said elite warriors of the Adeptus Astartes had landed in the northern sector. Others claimed to have heard distant thunder that didn't sound like artillery. Deeper, slower, almost like the footfall of something massive. No one knew which stories to believe, yet everyone listened. Anything that cracked the monotony of fear became sustenance. Our trench line had stabilized for the moment, though stabilization meant little when every hour brought new dead. The ground had grown slick with a mixture of rain and ash, transforming the trenches into narrow rivers of gray sludge that clung to boots and uniforms. The air tasted metallic, as if the planet itself exhaled the residue of conflict. We were rotated to a forward listening post, a dilapidated bunker half buried beneath debris and surrounded by craters that filled with stagnant water. The structure groaned with each gust of wind, as though it resented being asked to endure even one more day. Inside, only a handful of guardsmen remained. Corvin, who had stopped speaking except when addressed, Surcow, whose face never betrayed emotion, and Jorel, a conscript who had once been a clerk and still carried the faint scent of ink and paper beneath the grime. I found myself reassigned as well, though I suspected the officers placed soldiers at this post not for capability, but because losing us wouldn't alter the regiment's strength. It was a strange feeling, knowing the hierarchy weighed our worth in increments too small to matter. Night fell in slow, oppressive layers, turning the ruined landscape into an indistinct mass of shadows. The bunker's only illumination came from a single lumen cage with a flickering coil that buzzed intermittently. Joral attempted to repair it, mumbling that the dim light made it impossible to distinguish enemies from ghosts. Corvin sat in silence, cleaning his rifle with mechanical repetition. Surkow watched the perimeter, his eyes unblinking as though sleep had ceased to be a relevant concept. That was when the first story reached us. A runner from a neighboring post burst into the bunker, panting heavily, his uniform torn and spattered with mud. He claimed he had seen a figure moving across the battlefield, tall, impossibly tall, wrapped in a cloak the color of midnight, carrying a blade that shimmered like a burning prayer. He swore the figure moved through enemy fire, as though immune to it, each step leaving cracks in the earth. When pressed for details, he faltered, insisting the figure was too radiant to describe properly, but not radiant in the way saints were depicted in devotional scrolls, more like a light that hurt to look at, a presence that bent the air around it. Surkow dismissed the runner, saying battle shock often manifested as hallucination, especially under prolonged strain. Yet the runner insisted he had followed the figure for several minutes before losing sight of it near a collapsed manufactorum tower. His desperation made the air hum with unease before he finally departed, returning to his own position with the same frantic energy that had carried him here. After he left, silence settled over us again, but it was no longer neutral. It pressed against us, heavy with implication. We didn't discuss the encounter, though I caught Corvin glancing repeatedly toward the northern ridge, as if expecting something massive and hooded to appear out of the smoke. The next day came with another story. A squad from 3rd Platoon reported that they had heard chanting on the Vox, a deep, resonant cadence in a language no human tongue should produce. Instead of transmitting coordinates or orders, their Vox packs repeated the same fragmented phrase, layered with static that almost sounded like breathing. Command dismissed the report, stating the Vox equipment in that sector had been damaged during a bombardment. But the soldiers insisted the chant was too clear, too measured, too purposeful. Some swore the chanting continued even after the Vox units had been powered down. That night, as we rotated watch duties, Joral approached me with a confession. He claimed he had dreamed of a figure wreathed in golden light standing upon a shattered causeway. The figure didn't speak, yet Joral felt as though entire volumes of unspoken truth had been pressed into his skull. He awoke drenched in sweat, his heart pounding so fiercely that he feared it would burst. He said he did not understand the dream, but he believed it had meaning. I didn't know what to say. Dreams were dangerous things in the Imperium, especially when they arrived during war. They had a way of being interpreted as omens, or worse, as signs of corruption. Yet something in Joral's voice carried sincerity that made me hesitate before dismissing him. As the days passed, more stories surfaced, some whispered with reverence, others with dread. A pair of sentries claimed they had seen silhouettes standing atop a distant cliff, unmoving even as artillery fire erupted around them. The figures appeared clad in ornate armor, but the distance made details impossible to confirm. When the sentries returned with additional soldiers to verify their sighting, the figures had vanished, leaving behind only scorched earth and the faint smell of ozone. Another rumor circulated about a medic who had treated a wounded soldier delirious with fever. As the soldier drifted in and out of consciousness, he murmured a single phrase repeatedly. "The Emperor walks the battlefield." The medic wrote it off as the dying hallucination of a man with too much blood loss and too little hope. However, those who heard the story repeated it quietly, as though afraid the words might summon something listening beyond sight. Sleep became difficult. Even when exhaustion forced our bodies into unconsciousness, our minds refused to settle. Corvin grew restless, pacing the bunker during the early hours. Surkow started performing silent devotional gestures, tracing the imperial aquila over his heart without speaking. Joral had begun sketching shapes in the dirt, symbols that resembled wings, or perhaps flames, though he insisted he didn't remember drawing them. I found myself drifting between disbelief and uneasy curiosity. War had a way of wearing down skepticism until even the absurd seemed plausible. If a world could burn in a single day, if regiments could be erased by a single strategic miscalculation, if a commissar could shoot a man for blinking at the wrong time, then why couldn't visions walk the battlefield? Why couldn't the Emperor's presence, or something pretending to be it, manifest in places where hope struggled to exist? The turning point came during a late afternoon bombardment that shook our bunker to its foundations. The sky darkened with smoke, glowing intermittently as shells burst across the horizon. The trench line trembled beneath our feet. Dirt cascaded from the ceiling with each impact, coating us in a thin layer of gray dust. We scrambled into defensive positions, expecting an enemy assault. But none came. Instead, as the barrage continued, a sound drifted across the battlefield. It wasn't artillery, it wasn't lass fire, it wasn't human. It resembled chanting, deep, resonant, layered with tones that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. At first I thought it was my imagination, a trick of adrenaline and fear. But then Corvin froze, his eyes widening. Joral dropped his data slate. Even Surkow hesitated, his hand drifting toward his lasgun. The sound persisted, growing louder. It felt mechanical, yet organic, reverent, yet oppressive, beautiful, yet suffocating. The wind carried it like a litany recited by something ancient, something powerful, something completely unconcerned with mortal comprehension. The air vibrated with each note, stirring the dust around us into swirling patterns. Without warning, the chanting stopped. Silence swallowed the battlefield. An eerie calm descended, a fragile stillness so absolute it made our skin crawl. Even the distant artillery had ceased, as though the world were holding its breath. I dared not speak. None of us did. Words would have felt like a violation of that unnatural quiet. Then, somewhere far beyond the smoke, a flash of light erupted. Brief, brilliant, and golden. It was not the color of explosions or flares. It was too pure, too deliberate. The light surged once, twice, then vanished. A few seconds later, a tremor rippled through the ground, as if something colossal had landed or taken a single, earth-shaking step. Corvin whispered that he saw a silhouette within the light. Joral nodded slowly, as though confirming a truth he had long suspected. Surkow said nothing, but his knuckles whitened on the grip of his weapon. I did not know what I had seen, if I had seen anything at all. Yet in that moment, disbelief felt like the luxury of someone stationed on a world untouched by war. Here, buried beneath ash and fear, the boundary between vision and certainty had thinned. When the bombardment finally resumed, its thunder felt almost comforting, familiar, predictable, human. But something had shifted in the regiment's mood. The rumors spread faster than the returning artillery fire. Some claimed the Astartes were truly present, moving unseen through the smoke. Others said the Emperor himself had manifested briefly to inspire us. A few insisted the visions were the first signs of our collective collapse into madness. Whatever the explanation, the regiment held on to the stories. They clung to them like lifelines flung into a rising sea. Each retelling shaped them anew, turning fragments of observation into myth. War changed people, but rumor shaped them into believers. That night, as I lay awake, listening to the distant thunder of artillery, I wondered what frightened me more, that the visions were real, or that they were not. If they were real, then something unfathomable had stepped onto the battlefield. If they were not, then we had crossed into a realm where hope and fear twisted perception so completely that imagination had become indistinguishable from truth. In either case, we had changed. Something in the regiment's eyes carried a new intensity, a mixture of dread and anticipation. The next battle would not simply be another clash of weapons. It would be a test of faith, of resolve, of sanity itself. The line between the living and the lost had grown thin, and whatever walked beyond it waited for us. The final retreat began without ceremony, without farewell, without anything resembling the structured withdrawal described in training manuals. It unfolded like an unspoken agreement between the living and the dying, as if everyone on the front line simultaneously understood the truth. The planet was lost. The skies had already turned a sickly shade, the sun veiled behind layers of spore clouds and drifting aerosols that thickened the air until breathing felt like inhaling rot. The ground shuddered at irregular intervals, pulses traveling beneath the soil like a heartbeat too vast to belong to anything human. The Tyranids were shaping the world, and every tremor reminded us we stood on land that no longer answered to imperial law. The order to withdraw came from an officer whose voice cracked over the vox, distorted by interference and fear. He urged all remaining companies to fall back toward the central bastion, though we all knew the bastion had already been breached days earlier. No one challenged the order. Retreat meant movement. Movement meant survival, however fleeting. The alternative was to remain in the trenches until the ground split open and swallowed us whole, or until the enemy washed over us in a wave of chitin and claws. We abandoned our position under the dim glow of a failing dawn. What little light managed to pierce the corrupted sky made the battlefield look like a painting left too long in smoke. Colors muted, edges blurred, details eroded by ash. Our boots sloshed through mud thickened by blood and liquefied biomass. Every step felt like wading through the battlefield's memory of the dead. The distant screams of those who had failed to retreat echoed faintly, merging with the unnatural clicks and hisses that heralded Tyranid movement. Corvin marched silently beside me, his expression hollow. Surcow brought up the rear, scanning the ruins for signs of pursuit. Joral walked ahead, clutching his lasgun as though it were a sacred relic rather than a mass-produced weapon meant to die with its wielder. None of us spoke. Words felt fragile, too easily broken in the presence of encroaching annihilation. The landscape had transformed into a grotesque parody of itself. Imperial structures sagged under the weight of overgrown Tyranid bioforms that clung to metal surfaces like tumors. Veins of pulsing organic matter spread across walls and ground alike, glowing faintly with sickly luminescence. Where manufactorums once stood, towering organic pylons now reached skyward, releasing spores that drifted like malignant snow. Rivers had swollen with runoff, tainted by bioacid, their waters swirling in shades of green and black. The world no longer resembled a war zone. It resembled a wound. As we moved deeper into the abandoned district, we passed the remnants of squads that had attempted their own retreats. Some lay in craters, their bodies twisted in unnatural poses. Others appeared untouched by weapons, as though they had simply collapsed mid-step. Joral knelt beside one such soldier, staring at the man's face. The expression was peaceful, almost serene, contrasting violently with our surroundings. He looked like someone who had finally understood something moments before dying. Joral shuddered and rose quickly, wiping his hands on his uniform. The sounds grew louder the further we traveled, clicking, scraping, distant roars that resonated through the metal frames of collapsed structures. The Tyranids were near, though the shadows made it difficult to discern their movements. At times I glimpsed silhouettes darting between debris piles, their shapes fluid and unsettling. Yet none lunged at us. It felt as though the swarm was herding us, pushing us toward whatever fate awaited at the heart of the ruined city. Eventually, we reached the remnants of a once grand plaza that had served as a central gathering point for the regiment weeks earlier. Now it lay buried beneath layers of biomass, its statue of a heroic guardsman half consumed by creeping tendrils. A massive tyrannid spire rose from the center of the plaza, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Its surface writhed with smaller organisms, each contributing to the structure's unnatural growth. The sight froze us in place. "This wasn't here before," Corvin whispered. "No," Surkow replied, his voice strained. "It grew." Joral stepped closer, entranced by the rhythmic pulsing. His breaths became shallow, his hands trembling. He murmured something under his breath, words I couldn't decipher. When I placed a hand on his shoulder, he flinched violently and tore away, his face pale. "We shouldn't be here," he said, his voice shaking. "It's listening." I didn't understand what he meant until the spire shuddered, releasing a resonant hum that reverberated through my ribs. The ground beneath us rippled with movement as chitinous limbs scraped against stone. Dozens of tyrannid creatures emerged from tunnels, their eyes gleaming with predatory focus. For a moment, we all froze, expecting to be torn apart. But the creatures did not attack. They simply watched us. The silence that followed was suffocating. Surkow raised his weapon slowly, but Corvin grabbed his arm and shook his head. Even without speaking, it was clear firing would trigger a slaughter. The creature's patience felt calculated, almost cruel, as if they knew we were already trapped and saw no reason to rush. Then, from within the spire, a sound emerged, soft at first, then growing louder. A whisper, delicate and melodic, drifting through the plaza like a corrupted echo of prayer. The voice did not speak in any human language, yet the cadence suggested intent, meaning. Joral staggered back, covering his ears, his face contorted in panic. "It's inside," he gasped. "Inside my head." The voice continued, wrapping itself around us like a tendril. Its tone fluctuated between soothing and commanding, between promise and threat. The sensation made my skin crawl. It felt as though something ancient and alien pressed against my consciousness, searching for a way in. Corvin dropped to one knee, his rifle clattering to the ground. His eyes glazed over, his lips trembling. Surkow gritted his teeth, fighting to remain upright, his hands shaking violently. I felt a pressure settle behind my eyes, a sensation comparable to drowning, yet without the mercy of losing consciousness. The voice shifted, becoming sharper, hungrier. The tyrannid creatures surrounding us began to move, tightening their formation. They advanced slowly, not to kill, but to corral, herding us toward the spire's base. Each step they took synchronized with the pulsing of the structure, creating a rhythm that echoed through the plaza. I forced myself to move, grabbing Joral and pulling him away from the spire. His body resisted, as if drawn to the voice. Corvin struggled to rise, his breath ragged. Surkow fired a single shot into the air, the sharp crack disrupting the rhythm for a moment. The tyrannids hissed, but did not pounce. They seemed more interested in guiding us than destroying us. We fled toward a narrow alleyway flanked by collapsed buildings. The bioforms pulsed along the walls, their glow illuminating our path in sickly hues. The air thickened, making each breath a battle. Behind us, the creatures advanced steadily, their claws clicking against the stone. The voice persisted in our minds, growing frantic, almost pleading. When we emerged from the alley, we found ourselves in what remained of an ecclesiarchy chapel. The once majestic structure had been partially consumed by tyrannid growth, its stained glass windows shattered, its altar split in half. The air inside felt heavy with lingering devotion, as though the prayers once uttered within these walls had not yet dispersed entirely. Joral collapsed near the altar, clutching his head. Corvin leaned against a cracked pillar, trembling. Surkow stood near the entrance, watching for signs of pursuit. The voice faded gradually, replaced by the faint echo of our own ragged breathing. The chapel's silence felt almost sacred in comparison to the chaos outside. For several minutes we remained still, allowing our minds to settle. The alien presence receded, but its mark remained, an imprint of cold, analytical hunger that lingered like a phantom touch. "That thing was calling to us," Corvin said finally, his voice raw. "It wanted us alive." Surkow nodded grimly. "The swarm experiments. Learns. Adapts. Maybe it needs prisoners." Joral shook his head violently. "No, it wasn't the swarm. It was something else. Something deeper." I didn't know whether to believe him, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. Tyranids lacked individuality, yet the voice felt too focused, too intentional. It had felt like a presence, not a collective instinct, but a singular entity. Rumors existed about synaptic creatures capable of manipulating minds. But this had felt different, more aware. We couldn't remain in the chapel forever. The planet was dying, and the swarm's presence grew stronger with each passing hour. We decided to push toward the extraction point, a location that Command had vaguely marked on our maps. Whether any transports remained was uncertain, but moving felt better than waiting for the swarm to reclaim what it had nearly taken. As we stepped outside, the world greeted us with ruin. Tyranid spires loomed in every direction, dwarfing the remaining Imperial structures. The sky churned with clouds that pulsed with unnatural colors. The ground trembled intermittently, as though reacting to some subterranean movement. We marched. The journey blurred into a haze of exhaustion and terror. We encountered few other survivors, and those we met wore expressions hollowed by despair. One soldier muttered incoherently about a vision he had seen, a radiant figure standing atop a mound of corpses, whispering that salvation was near. His voice shook with equal parts hope and dread. Another survivor claimed the Tyranids spoke through the planet itself, that the whispers were warnings to flee before something even worse arrived. Rumors swirled around us like dust, impossible to grasp fully, yet impossible to ignore. When we finally reached the extraction zone, we found only devastation. Landers lay shattered, transports reduced to twisted metal. The landing pads had been consumed by biogrowth, their surfaces writhing with organisms that pulsed in synchrony with the distant spires. Joral fell to his knees, his hope extinguished. Corvin slumped against a broken railing, his strength finally depleted. Surkow stared into the distance, his expression unreadable. A roar echoed across the plains, a sound so deep it rattled the bones. Tyranid forms moved across the horizon, an endless wave of chitin and teeth advancing toward us. Their silhouettes merged into a single mass, as though the planet itself had risen to devour us. We had nowhere left to run. Yet in that moment, as the swarm approached, something shifted in the air. A warm breeze swept across the ruins, carrying with it the faintest scent of incense. Light flickered in the clouds, dim at first, then brightening into a soft, golden glow. The illumination danced across the battlefield, casting long shadows that swayed like spirits. Corvin's breath caught. Joral looked up, his eyes wide. Even Surkow's posture changed, a subtle easing of tension. For a moment, just one, it felt as though the Emperor himself watched us. But the light faded swiftly, swallowed by the encroaching storm. Whether it had been a vision, a trick of the dying sun, or the last desperate projection of our exhausted minds, we would never know. As the Tyranids closed in, I felt an unexpected calm. Survival had carried us this far, but survival no longer dictated the future. What mattered now was bearing witness to the world that had died, to the regiment that had fought, to the flicker of hope that had refused to extinguish itself entirely. Perhaps the galaxy would never learn our names. Perhaps no one would find our bodies. But in that final stand, as chitin scraped against stone and the swarm surged forward, we became something more than expendable. We became the memory of a dying world. And memories, even fleeting ones, have power.